Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American Republic?
Hello everybody. Earlier this week we had something that Donald Trump calls Liberation Day, a day in which he was celebrating economic tariffs, but it's anything but liberating, I think, for most of us, because we don't really understand the numbers. All sorts of arguments about whether this is justified or not, all sorts of arguments about progress. My guest today, though, perhaps can help us. I'm not sure if she's an expert on tariffs, but she is an expert on what she calls counting what really matters. She's the director, she's the professor of public policy at Cambridge University, and the author of the new book, The Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters. Diane Coyle is joining us from a warm, sunny Cambridge. Diane, congratulations on the new book.
Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you.
So why do we all get headaches, Diane, from all the numbers that get thrown around in the wake of the Trump tariff announcements? Economists are arguing one thing or another. He, of course, argues that tariffs are good. Others argue they're bad. Why are all these economic issues so problematic and so open to different interpretations?
Well, the problem from my perspective is that the numbers that we have available, the statistics to understand what's going on in the economy, were set up about 80 years ago in the decade after the Second World War. And the character of the economy has changed completely since then. So to take your tariff example, one of the things that's changed and started in the 1980s and is now really well established is that a lot of production crosses international boundaries. So that rather than importing only finished goods like a complete car or a complete washing machine, companies in America and elsewhere are importing lots of components as well. These supply chains that cross borders are really difficult to track in the economic statistics. And that means that we can probably assume that tariffs are not going to be a good thing for economic growth. They never have been. But we don't really know where it's going to bite, what shortages there will be, how much input costs will go up for American manufacturers. So it's not just that there is probably going to be a negative effect, it's actually going to be really difficult to track what the impact is going to be on American businesses. And the same is true for a lot of other things that have happened in the economy for the past 10 or 20 years. They're not reflected in the way we collect the statistics now. And that means it's just hard to set good policies that make the life of citizens better.
That's ironic, isn't it? Given that we supposedly, Diane, live in the age of big data where everything is quantifiable and all our data, for better or worse, is collected. Are you saying that we're not very good at collecting the data, or are you saying that the nature of the data has changed? So when it comes to something like tariffs, it's so complicated that it's harder and harder to actually put the data together.
Well, the data that we need has changed. We're pretty good at collecting the kind of data that we needed for the 20th century. We're much less good at collecting the kinds of data that would be useful now. So apart from the supply chain example, who is importing which components and where from, another example might be data itself. It's a driver of the AI revolution. It's incredibly valuable. The companies that use data have really high stock market values, and yet we don't know how much data is being used, or how much cloud services are being used, or how much that is costing companies. And it's because they're new enough that the means of collecting that kind of data haven't been put in place. And it would probably be different anyway from the old-fashioned way of collecting, which was to send out surveys to businesses, interview households, and those kinds of survey methods are breaking down. People don't want to bother with that anymore. So we need to come up with some new, more automated methods anyway.
One of your previous books is GDP, A Brief but Affectionate History. I think only economists could be affectionate about something called GDP, Gross Domestic Product. But you talked about 20th century metrics versus 21st century metrics. Given that your book on GDP is a history, are you suggesting that GDP was the right kind of metric or an appropriate metric for the 20th century? Is that the kind of metric that actually worked in a previous economic age?
It was good enough for the 20th century. People always pointed out some drawbacks. For example, it didn't reflect well how much we're using up natural resources, and that tells you about can we produce as much in future. And it didn't reflect unpaid care, which affects people's decisions about going out to paid work, going into the labour market. But as long as things weren't changing, we could live with that because it's a useful indicator for monetary policy and government's tax and spending policy. But it's become decreasingly useful for the kind of economy that we have now. And understanding things like data, how much valuable open source software is being created, the supply chains example, and even the categorization of companies and jobs is no longer fit for purpose. And so the current book, the new book, is more about looking forward to what we ought to be doing, whereas GDP, the previous book, which has jokes, by the way, I'd recommend it to anybody, was looking backwards.
Only an economist could make jokes about GDP, Diane. Yeah, thinking out loud here, I grew up in the UK of the 70s and 80s, and GDP was used by all politicians. They would say, well, we've increased GDP, and no one ever said, well, GDP is irrelevant or it doesn't work. They would all argue one way or the other. There are no real equivalents today, thinking out loud. I mean, when Trump talks about tariffs, he's obviously politicizing it, and people in his camp think he's right, and others don't. I'm not a big fan, I have to admit. But there are no equivalents of GDP today. I mean, what are the metrics? I take your point that we need to invent new ones in the early 21st century economy of big data and AI, and we'll get to that later. But are there still metrics for you in 2025 that work, that have some value?
GDP is not completely without value, but it's not just the tariffs issue, is it? Howard Lutnick raised a really interesting point about should government spending be taken out of GDP? And one can speculate that that was because if government spending is going to collapse, then GDP growth will be negative, and that won't look very good. The drawback then is that if the US was the only country to take out the government spending part of GDP, it would look much poorer compared to other countries. So maybe it's not such a great idea tactically. But it's actually a valid debate, and it was much debated when GDP was created in the 1940s. I mean, the key point for me is that it's not a natural object. It's not a mountain. You're not trying to take the temperature of anything real. It's an idea. And the idea changes according to need. The economic statistics are there to help the government and businesses make good decisions. And that's just not there for us now. And so one of the things I do in the new book is try to set out some alternative approaches to give us useful metrics that would help make better decisions.
The father of your science, quite literally, I think, Diane, is, of course, John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist, certainly British economist, but probably globally, the most famous, iconic economist. He famously said, in the long run, we're all dead. In terms of these metrics, how critical, we've done whole shows with economists, have written books about the value of the long term, the short term, the medium term. How essential is time in all this narrative when it comes to counting what really matters? Because metrics today are very different from metrics in 2030 or 2040 or 2130.
So I'd answer that in two ways. One is that time is a really useful lens on whether productivity is increasing or not. Very often, inventions that drive productivity growth are about saving time, whether that's the logistics that Walmart uses or Amazon uses, or whether it's the introduction of steamships rather than sailing ships. And so automation is about speeding up processes. And the other side of that coin is how are we, everybody in the economy, spending our time, and do we like how we're spending it? And one aspect of that is how much leisure can we get? Americans, notoriously to anybody based in Europe, have very little leisure compared to us. We've made a different choice there. But also, it's a signal of the quality of the services that we're buying. There are some services where we just want it to happen really quickly. There are others where you want high quality time spent by skilled people, and you'll pay the price for that. So it might be that you go to the barber shop and pay $20 for a quick haircut, or you want to go to a fancy salon and pay much more, but have the head massage and the chat and all of that. So time itself is an interesting lens. But the other aspect, and I think your question maybe goes to this more, is highlighted by that Keynes quote, what happens in the long run. And just as any company would be foolish not to have a good sense of its balance sheet, as well as its profit and loss, then the economy needs a good sense of its balance sheet. What are the resources available to carry on growing in the future? And if we did that, we wouldn't be as cavalier as Keynes was about what's going to happen in the long term. We'd know whether the capital equipment being used by companies had been maintained, or was it depreciating? We'd know about the quality of the infrastructure. We'd know about how much human capital, what are the skills and health of the population, and so on. So I'm going to advocate for two things. One is use time itself as a measure of what's happening in the economy. And the other is embed the long term by having a balance sheet.
Yeah, it's interesting. Embed the long term by having a balance sheet. Diane, I don't want to, again, make this another conversation about Trump, but he, of course, politicizes economics. I mean, I don't think there's such a thing as for him as economics. It's just politics. To what extent are these numbers themselves always hostages of political fortune? So Trump has said very openly, I don't care if Americans spend less money on cars. We're still raising more revenue. And I think it's Lutnick or one of the other economic people in his administration talk now about raising more money than has ever been raised before. I think it's his tariffs expert, the China guy, saying that, but of course, ultimately, the money that's being raised is a form of taxation. Some people would argue the consumers end up paying because they pay for more expensive cars, and the tariffs are going into the coffers of the US states. So has it ever been possible to separate numbers from politics? Are they always hostages to political arguments of one kind or another?
I think they are always political. The word statistics itself has the same root as state. And some of the earliest measures were about exactly raising enough taxation. William Petty was one of the first people to put together economic statistics in the 17th century in England. And it was all about calculating how long England could afford to be at war with France, how much taxation, how much tax revenue would the economy generate. And I think the question it raises is what are the numbers for, and what are the revenues for? What is your target? And so there are different purposes for economic statistics. The purpose for GDP is macroeconomic management. It's why Keynes set it up the way he did. But there's a lot of appetite now for a measure that reflects whether people's lives are getting better or not. And the fact that tariff revenues might go up doesn't really tell you that.
Yeah, it seems increasingly to be a kind of shell game. You're a trained economist, but you're the professor of public policy at Cambridge. Is that one of the reasons why you yourself, in terms of your career, are more interested in public policy than pure economics? That there's always a political angle to this stuff?
Well, economics used to be called political economy. And I think one of the mistakes economists have made previously is pretending that they're like plumbers or engineers, that there's a defined problem and we know the right answer to the problem. And I think it's part of the reason that there's, in some circles, real distrust of economists because, as you're hinting in your question, there are a lot of value judgments involved, or political judgments, if you prefer. I would rather we were honest about that, and that when we do an economic analysis, we reflect the kinds of judgments that are involved. And if you do jobs in public policy, as I have, you have to take those political constraints into account. There's no point recommending something that can't possibly be implemented because those aren't the political views of the government that you're working for.
Yeah, sort of what you're doing is historicizing science or historicizing math. The book is about why we use an 80-year-old metric to understand today's economy, which suggests that even metrics are themselves historical, that they're not just eternally true. Is that the case with all metrics, Diane, especially when it comes to economics?
That's true, but it's not even just the metrics, it's the concepts that the metrics reflect. It's what is our idea of, fundamentally, what is our idea of a good life that gets reflected in economic activity? But it's true of science as well. If you think back to the history of, chemistry, when there was the idea of phlogiston, and people used to try to measure the amount of phlogiston in the atmosphere, and we've changed the concepts. And so there's always this dance between the ideas we have about how the world operates and what we measure, and then what we measure sort of feeds back to us. There's a feedback loop, and we think that it's therefore true about the way the world operates.
The idea of the good life, you're very charming and cheerful, Diane. You're wearing a lovely red suit, but most people wouldn't associate the good life with economists. Economists are supposed to crunch numbers, and they're supposed to be rather dull. Should we trust economists with the idea of the good life? Are you suggesting maybe that the establishment of metrics should be determined by fiction writers or philosophers? There's a guy over at Oxford who's been on the show who talks about being a good ancestor. We're going to come to the environment later. But can we trust economists with determining what the good life should or shouldn't be?
I wouldn't trust only economists to do that. We do have advantages. Economists are typically very numerate, highly analytical, not afraid of pointing out trade-offs that really exist, which is one of the reasons that we're thought of as being very unpopular.
The dismal science is what some people call it.
It is indeed called the dismal science. But most economists are actually in the business because they have a fundamental belief that things can get better. And if you study economic history, there have been ups and downs, but that's for 250, 300 years, a story of things getting much better in terms of people's length of life, health, the pleasures of life, the ability to have leisure. So it's a very positive story, really.
Is it still a positive story then?
Well, it's obviously become much less so. And
why not? Why do you say obviously? There's a great debate about that, isn't it?
I say obviously because for median families in most of the OECD, the rich countries, there's been very little increase in their real incomes since probably the financial crisis. And even where there has been a growth in the average, the distribution has been very unequal. So for a lot of people not to see their living standards getting on for 20 years, that's a real shock after the 250 years of pretty steady progress. And that, I think, helps explain a lot about political polarization and discontent that voters in many countries feel with the establishment or the elite or whatever you want to call it.
There's, of course, a rival science to economics is behavioral economics, which suggests that we're not perhaps quite as rational as we like to think we are, or maybe as conventional economists would like to think we are. Are we able, Diane, to make rational decisions about raising or lowering the standard of living, the good life? You talk about the metrics suggesting that we're not as wealthy as we used to be, but it seems to be deeply subjective. In America these days, everyone's obsessing over the price of eggs, which seems very arbitrary and subjective.
It's very tricky to figure out what perspective you ought to be taking in deciding how well things are going. And the price of eggs, it is symbolic of the fact that food takes up a high proportion of the spending of people on relatively low incomes, along with energy and rent. And so, for people who are in that position, you would want a price index that reflects their spending patterns. And what we have in general is a price index that reflects the average across the whole economy. And that tends to promote distrust. Inflation, CPI, has always been a really political indicator. And the kind of commissions like the Boskin Commission in the 1990s that claimed it had been overstated because it left out a lot of the effects of innovation, that was politically controversial because it was seen as an attempt to reduce the extent to which social security payments or wages were indexed. So inflation's always a very political number, and I'm not really surprised the price of eggs has become such a symbol. I was recently in the States myself, and we pay much less for our eggs here in the UK than you guys do.
Yeah, I'm not going to make any omelette jokes, Diane. You talked about big data. You're giving a lecture later this year on the automating the economic style of reasoning, the Wittgenstein lectures in Germany. I actually broke down your book on Google through Gemini, through AI. How is the AI revolution, the automating of data, how is that going to change, or how should it change our measure of progress? Is it one more hindrance, or does it offer solutions, progress to measuring progress?
I think it offers some solutions. I'm not sure that we're going to get to them very quickly. So there are two aspects to your question. One is it going to help us measure things better? Well, for sure, it should help us collect different kinds of data and better and faster. The question in my mind is how quickly and where is it going to improve productivity? Because that's what drives living standards longer term. Productivity is the word for what things of value do we get from the effort and the materials and the resources that we put in. And so it's a kind of fundamental measure. AI ought to be able to improve productivity in lots of ways. But I think we need to think carefully about how humans and AIs are going to take decisions together. It's not obvious that you always get better outcomes. And in fact, it surfaces some real dilemmas because AI doesn't like political compromise, it doesn't like fudge. We disparage it as fudge, but it's often the way you have to get things done when people disagree with each other or have conflicts of interest.
Although I actually, my experience of AI is the reverse. AI is very nervous about taking positions, which may reflect its owners because they don't want to get sued or they don't want to appear biased. So sometimes AI is always on the one hand, on the other. So I would actually like my AI, maybe my AI is different from yours. I use Anthropic's Claude to be a little bit more decisive, to be willing to take positions.
Yeah, maybe it's a prompt engineer, and we all need to learn to become prompt engineers. But I wasn't thinking about the chatbots so much as the kinds of algorithms that rank people for medical treatments or determine whether people get bail or not in the criminal justice system, or determine whether they're eligible for some kinds of welfare benefits. And these automated decision mechanisms are being rolled out in these kinds of areas. And it isn't at all obvious that we're getting better outcomes using them. Faster, for sure. It may look more productive in that sense, but they may not be the ones that society wants.
I wonder, in your analysis and research for measure of progress in terms of determining economic progress or economic metrics, whether you noted that we are all not just hostages of politics and of time, but also of culture. So the kind of metrics that might dominate the Anglo-American economist like yourself would be different from the measure of progress being used by Chinese economists or Danish economists. Is there a universal, mostly amongst your colleagues around the world? Are the Chinese economists that you know, they're using the same measures of progress?
That's very interesting. So the GDP figures, the system of national accounts as it's called, is a universal standard. It's set by the United Nations. All countries that are UN members are supposed to produce their statistics in the same ways. But you're absolutely right to say that it's not only culture, but the structure of economies is different as well. So an economy like China would still have a lot of services and an informal sector that's much larger and lower cost than the equivalent in economies like the United States. Low-income economies in sub-Saharan Africa would have a different structure again. And it's actually very hard to make fair comparisons across these really different structures, but we do that with the GDP figures. And there is beginning to be more dissent about conforming to the United Nations standards. It's difficult for some countries to do. It's a complicated, costly exercise to develop these kinds of statistics and do them regularly. And I think there is, in many countries, much greater interest now in stepping outside the boundaries of the way that we've been doing this for 80 years and coming up with something new. So, I never thought economic statistics would interest anybody. I'd be the kind of person you'd avoid talking to at parties. But actually, the amount of interest in this is really surprising.
Yeah, I wonder whether we'll look back at GDP, your affectionate history, and look back with the affection because it was a world where there was agreement, where there was a strong United Nations. It's kind of cause and effect. And in a world where the United Nations, or the ideal of the United Nations, has some credibility, we can agree on statistics. In a more fragmented world, which seems to be a feature of the 2020s, this agreement on the metrics of progress will be one of the casualties of fragmentation.
It may be. I mean, during the Cold War, the former Soviet bloc had a different set of metrics. They didn't use GDP.
To put it mildly, right? And an entirely different economy, and I mean an entirely different way of thinking about economics. Last year, I did a show with Daniel Susskind. His book, Growth, was shortlisted for the FT Book of the Year. And he talks about rethinking growth, particularly in terms of the environment. In some ways, he's in Tim Jackson's camp, who's a great critic of development. And Jason Hickel, both Hickel and Jackson have been on the show. Hickel in particular is a pioneer of the idea or the promise of degrowth. How does the idea or promise of degrowth fit into your arguments about the measure of progress? I'm guessing that for guys like Jackson and Hickel and perhaps even Susskind, the metrics we need are warning us about how we're destroying the planet and our own psyches in late stage capitalism.
Well, I would agree in a sense. I think it's essential that we have an economy that's sustainable in the broadest sense. So not just environmental resources, but also physical assets and the investment that we make in people in their health and education. It's my balance sheet argument that we want to grow for our own benefit, but also make sure that future generations can enjoy at least as high living standards as we have. Where I would disagree is about the need to degrow, which I think is partly a misunderstanding about what GDP measures. If you look at the amount of natural resources involved in $1 of GDP growth now, it's been declining substantially over time. My very first book in 1997 was called The Weightless World. It was about this phenomenon that GDP growth is increasingly an intangible thing. It's about ideas. And it's the ideas that drive our prosperity longer term. So for the degrowth, my question is, okay, so we invent a new medical treatment that's going to add to GDP. What are you going to take away and from whom to get your reduction in GDP, your reduced growth? And I think it's both that misunderstanding, but also politically dishonest in a way, not to talk about who is going to have less and how is that redistribution going to come about.
Finally, Diane, you've been very generous with my rather dumb questions, non-economist questions, but your book suggests that we need different data collected in different framework of categories and definitions, and you offer some suggestions about what that would entail. So perhaps we might end with a short introduction to how you would like to see progress quantified in the early 21st century.
Well, your questions have been great questions, actually. Don't denigrate yourself. So the recommendations I would make follow from the arguments I've made with you about capturing what is actually happening in the economy now, because we're not doing that. So that's a lot of detailed work about aspects of the digital economy and increasingly AI, which we're hardly measuring at all, and then starting to set up this balance sheet. So it's a long process, and it's detailed, technical, boring statistical work. And just as GDP and the related figures took probably 20 to 30 years to get to their current state in the post-war era, it's a 20-year task. It's a big task. But I think there is a real appetite now among many countries for an international effort to create a kind of consensus around what we need for the better measurement in the future.
And finally, Diane, one-word answer on this. Tariffs, good or bad?
Bad.
That was simple. Well, Diane Coyle, professor of public policy at Cambridge, someone who knows what they're talking about and has a new book out, Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters, Princeton University Press, a real expert, someone who we should all listen to. Thank you so much, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you. It's been great to talk to you.